Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
Welcome to the United States Sentencing Commission's hearing on fentanyl, fentanyl analogues, and synthetic cannabinoids. The Commission appreciates the attendance of those joining us here, as well as those watching our live stream broadcast on the Commission's website. As always, we appreciate the significant public interest in the work of the Commission, particularly this year as we tackle the important and emerging issue of synthetic drugs. I want to start by introducing the other members of the Commission. To my immediate left is Commissioner Rachel Barco. Commissioner Barco is the Siegel Family Professor of Regulatory Law and Policy at the New York University School of Law and serves as the Faculty Director of the Center on the Administration of Criminal Law at the Law School. Judge Charles Breyer joins us by telephone. Judge Breyer, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Good deal. Judge Breyer is the Senior District Judge for the Northern District of California and has served as the United States District Judge since 1998. Judge Danny Reeves, to my right, is a District Judge for the Eastern District of Kentucky and has served in that position since 2001 and joined the Commission this year. And finally, Zachary Boleto is the ex officio commissioner from the Department of Justice. Commissioner Boleto serves as counsel to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Before we begin the hearing, I would like to update briefly the public on some of the Commission's most recent work. Since our last meeting on October 4th, the Commission has released two publications. On October 25th, the Commission issued a report analyzing drug mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenses in the federal system. The report provides sentencing data on offenses carrying drug mandatory minimums, the impact on the federal prison population, and differences observed when analyzing each of the five main drug types. It also highlights important changes and trends in mandatory minimum sentencing since the Commission's 2011 report. And on November 14th, the Commission issued a report that examines the relationships between demographic factors such as race and gender and sentencing outcomes. This report is an update of the analysis the Commission performed for its 2012 Booker report. Also, the Commission has collected and included data about violence in an offender's criminal history, which was not included in our previous analysis. The Commission will release one more publication before the end of the year, which focuses on the relationship between age and recidivism. The Commission has also continued its work on the emerging and urgent issue of public concern, synthetic drugs. This is our third public hearing on the general issue of synthetic drugs. We held a public hearing on synthetic drugs on April 18th, which was within weeks of the Commission regaining its quorum, and another on October 4th, which focused on synthetic cathinones. The issues raised by these emerging synthetic drugs are very complicated and novel in many respects, and it is essential for the Commission to provide clear and practical guidance to courts on how to properly and fairly account for them under the guidelines. For that reason, we look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses today. Today's public hearing will focus on fentanyl, fentanyl analogues, and synthetic cannabinoids. We will hear testimony from experts on the pharmacological effects of these drugs and their chemical structure, observations from the medical community, and the challenges these drugs pose to law enforcement. At the end of each panel's testimony, panelists may receive questions from the Commission members, and I will then give Judge Breyer the opportunity to ask his questions over the phone. We look forward to a thoughtful and engaging discussion. Each witness has been allotted 5 minutes for their statements. You will begin when the light turns green. Yellow means there's 1 minute left, and red means your time has expired, and we'd appreciate you then bringing your remarks to a close. Our first panel consists of members of the law enforcement community. Our panelists are Mr. Robert Perez, Mr. Joseph Schleigh, and Major Juan Colon. Mr. Perez is the Acting Assistant Commissioner, Operations Support of the United States Customs and Border Protection. Previously, Mr. Perez served as the Director of Field Operations for CBP's New York Field Office, as Director of Field Operations and Port Director in Detroit, Michigan, and as the first Director of the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism in Washington, where he oversaw the development and implementation of all the anti-terrorism industry partnership programs for CBP. Mr. Perez is a graduate of the Senior Executive Fellows Program at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and earned his undergraduate degree in economics from Rutgers University. Mr. Schleigh is the acting section chief of the Synthetic Drugs and Chemicals Section's Diversion Control Division of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. He was assigned to DOS, I can't avoid acronyms this morning, in October 2014 as a staff coordinator, where his duties included liaison with the Joint Interagency Task Force West on shipments of precursor chemicals from Asia to the Americas, as well as covering Mexico, Central America, and the Far East region. Before his assignment to DEA headquarters, he was a group supervisor to the DEA in Lima, Peru, in their country office from 2008 to 2014, and in the DEA Tampa District Office, assigned to the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, HIDTA, Task Force, concentrating on methamphetamine and cocaine trafficking in Florida. Major Colon is a 24-and-a-half-year veteran of the New Jersey State Police, and he is currently assigned to the New Jersey Attorney General's Office under the Office of Drug Addiction Control, working on drug policy. As the architect of New Jersey's Drug Monitoring Initiative, he maintains oversight of the initiative and is also involved in several state working groups to drive state-level counter-drug efforts. During most of his career, Major Colon has focused on the intelligence function, and he has extensive experience with street gangs and organized crime. As an intelligence collector targeting these groups, he managed numerous informants and has conducted several undercover operations. Major Colon earned his undergraduate degree in public administration from Fairleigh Dickinson University. He has received several awards for his accomplishments and was nominated for the 2014 Trooper of the Year Award. We'll begin with Major Colon.
Thank you, Judge, and it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here before you. Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to be speaking about the state-level perspective of fentanyl. So highly potent opioids such as fentanyl and its analogs are driving New Jersey's high rate of drug-related deaths, which increased 163% between 2010 and 2016, where there were more than 2,200 deaths. Although millions of dollars have been invested to support various efforts against the scourge, illicit drug distributors have countered these efforts by introducing fentanyl and its analogs into the state's drug environment. The presence and increased prevalence of potent fentanyl analogs, such as cyclopropylfentanyl and carfentanil, they could raise the 2017 death toll to as high as 2,600, translating to an average of 7 drug-related deaths per day in the state of New Jersey. How did we get here? Well, the first phase of this epidemic is attributed to the high number of prescription opioids dispensed during the 1990s. The second phase evolved as many users who became addicted to prescription opioids transitioned to using heroin. Since the year 2000, heroin and prescription opioids have been driving the state's a rising number of fatal and non-fatal overdoses, as well as the violent crimes and burglaries that we're experiencing every day in the state. To understand the scope of the problem in 2009, we began the Drug Monitoring Initiative, which helps us identify the presence and prevalence of drugs by tracking the number of the number of times specific drugs are involved in deaths, overdoses, as well as arrests. We're also able to identify suspected drug overdose spikes and hotspots by tracking naloxone deployments by law enforcement and EMS throughout the state. And all of the information helps us identify the overall impact on public safety and public health. The third phase was identified in 2014 when a drug specimen was submitted for analysis, and it revealed that there was no heroin involved in that packet, but it was in fact all fentanyl. As a result of this finding, we asked the 9 crime labs to start identifying all of the substances that were being mixed with or sold as heroin. Several cases from 2013 were re-examined and reclassified as fentanyl involved. This is a clear indication that fentanyl had been in the state's drug environment and that it was not being identified, reported, or monitored. Since then, crime labs and medical examiners have identified 2 U-series opioids and 14 fentanyl class compounds, which are extremely potent, and these include cyclopropylfentanyl as well as carfentanil. To speak about the potency, 1 kilogram of fentanyl can kill 500,000 people, and it's estimated that 1 kilogram of carfentanil can kill as many as 50 million people. These fentanyl class compounds pose occupational hazards, as there have been several exposures. Because of the increased presence of fentanyl, naloxone administrations climbed from 5,175 during 2014 to 12,200 this year so far. Meanwhile, we have this this drug that's supposed to save lives, but yet deaths continue to rise year over year. We're now into the 4th phase of this synthetic storm, as fake prescription pills are being pressed with fentanyl analogs. Why is this happening? It's all economics. As we see it in the state, it started with the pharmaceutical companies, and now it's the illicit drug market making the big profits. 1 kilogram of fentanyl can be purchased for approximately $200 from China when purchased directly. This same kilogram yields the equivalent of 20 to 25 kilograms of heroin, costing approximately $1.2 million. Both gross approximately $5 million. While wholesale heroin transactions involve cartel and gang members, fentanyl can discreetly be purchased via the dark web and delivered via legitimate parcel services. So where are we headed? Well, fentanyl is here to stay because of its advantages over heroin. It is much cheaper to produce, much more potent, easier to smuggle, and much easier to acquire by any citizen in the state.
Thank you, Major. Mr. Schleigh?
Judge Breyer and members of the Sentencing Commission, on behalf of the Drug Enforcement Administration, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the threat posed by fentanyl, fentanyl analogues, and synthetic cannabinoids. Synthetic designer drugs, also known as new psychoactive substances, NPS, refer to synthetic drugs designed to mimic the effects of known licit and illicit controlled substances. These substances are oftentimes unscheduled and unregulated. There are a variety of synthetic designer drugs which are categorized based on the types of controlled substances they are intended to mimic, namely cannabinoids and opioids. Synthetic drugs have flooded the United States and have put not only our adult citizens but our children at risk of death or permanent injury. This tragedy is a primary focus for DEA that is overwhelming our country and law enforcement. Synthetic cannabinoids are dangerous substances that are marketed as legal high and have severe adverse effects that are unpredictable in their psychological and physical impact on each individual. Since 2009, DEA has received an increasing number of reports from poison control centers, hospitals, and law enforcement agencies concerning products containing synthetic cannabinoids. Emergency room physicians report that individuals who use these types of products experience dangerous side effects, including convulsions, agitation, dangerously elevated heart rates, vomiting, seizures, violent behavior, coma, and even death. These synthetic drugs are intended to mimic the effects of THC, the primary psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, but they are much more powerful. These substances are easily available through various outlets, from the internet convenience stores, gas stations, street dealers, and drug trafficking organizations. Anyone is easily able to order these substances directly to their doorstep without detection or purchase them locally with little scrutiny. These synthetic powders are transported into the United States in powder form via common carrier, processed, then distributed throughout the country under various brand names. Synthetic cannabinoids are primarily manufactured in and imported into the U.S. from China. They are produced by foreign chemists, usually in powder form and without quality control. After entering the U.S., the substances are commonly mixed with plant material, acetone, color, and flavoring to create most cannabinoid designer substances. They may also be mixed with other substances and placed in capsule, tablet, or powder form. DEA has become increasingly alarmed over the proliferation of illicitly clandestine produced fentanyl and its analogs. These substances have been added to heroin and other illicit substances and have also been encountered as counterfeit tablets resembling controlled prescription drugs. Clandestinely produced fentanyl and fentanyl analogs are potent synthetic opioids which present a serious risk of overdose and death by those who use these illicit drugs. The 2015 market for misused opioid prescription pain relievers was 12.5 million people, and an additional 2.1 million new misusers in 2016. If illicit fentanyl is introduced into even a small portion of that overall market, there is a risk that overdoses will increase. The high potency of fentanyl and its analogs makes it particularly dangerous for public safety personnel who encounter fentanyl during the course of their daily operations. Fentanyl and fentanyl analogs represent the deadly convergence of synthetic drug threat and the current national opioid epidemic. It should be noted that illicitly clandestine produced fentanyl is still the prevalent synthetic opioid encountered in the United States. In conclusion, synthetic cannabinoids and opioids such as fentanyl and fentanyl analogs will continue to pose a nationwide threat for the foreseeable future. Synthetic drugs producers continue to modify and experiment with chemical structures in search of new compounds. Once a new drug is formulated, the internet and social media are used to market the product, allowing for its fast adoption and use. Distributors continue to reap significant profits before new legislative and regulatory controls of these specific synthetic compounds are implemented. The DEA, in conjunction with federal, state, and local partners, will continue to address this threat by pursuing those who brought tremendous harm to our citizens and communities. DEA is committed to doing everything we can to address this threat. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Schleigh. Mr. Perez.
Acting Chair Breyer and distinguished commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss the role of U.S. Customs and Border Protection in combating the flow of dangerous synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl, into the United States. As America's unified border agency, CBP plays a critical role in preventing dangerous drugs, including fentanyl and its analogs, from reaching the American public. The majority of illicit synthetic drugs smuggled into the U.S. is done so through international mail facilities, express consignment carrier facilities, or through our ports of entry along the southern border. CBP seizures of fentanyl have significantly increased over the past few years, from approximately 2 pounds seized in 2013 to over 400 pounds in 2016 to what we expect to be over 1,000 pounds seized so far this year. Fentanyl is CBP's most frequently seized illicit synthetic opioid. Interdiction efforts at and between the ports of entry, leveraging targeting and intelligence-driven strategies, and working with our partners to combat drug traffickers and transnational criminal organizations are key components of our multi-layered, risk-based approach to enhance security of our borders. Interdicting illicit drugs, particularly synthetic opioids, are challenging and complex. Along our southern border, heroin is often spiked with fentanyl. Fentanyl is also sometimes spiked with other substances and sold as synthetic heroin. In the mail and express consignment environments, individual purchasers move fentanyl in small quantities to try to evade detection and interdiction by law enforcement. CBP uses the same drug interdiction methods to seize fentanyl as it uses to detect other drugs coming across the border. For example, At our National Targeting Center, CBP leverages advanced information alongside law enforcement and intelligence records to identify smuggling trends and target shipments that may contain illicit substances or related equipment being diverted for illicit use, such as pill presses, tablet machines, and precursor chemicals. The National Targeting Center also serves as a critical focal point of daily collaboration between CBP and many critical law enforcement partners, including the DEA, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security investigations, the FBI, and members of the intelligence community. In addition to their experience and training, CBP officers and agents use various forms of technology and equipment to detect synthetic drugs hidden on people, in cargo containers, and in other conveyances. In the express consignment environment, CBP can place an electronic hold and notify carriers that a parcel needs to be presented for inspection. Together with the U.S. Postal Service, CBP is working to develop the same capability in the international mail environment through an advanced data pilot program. Through CBP's Field Triage Infrared Reachback program, infrared spectrometers are utilized to collect data from substances believed to be or to contain synthetic drugs, which is subsequently transmitted to our laboratories for interpretation. Trained scientists are then able to identify classes of drugs and flag them for comprehensive testing, even if the drugs had not been seen before. Canine operations are another invaluable component of CBP's counter-narcotic operations. Since the completion of a pilot program earlier this year, CBP has begun to add fentanyl as a trained odor to deployed narcotic detection canine teams at our ports of entry. Over 100 CBP canine teams are now trained to detect fentanyl. CBP has also implemented a program to provide training and equipment to keep our frontline employees safe from accidental opioid overdose. Through our ongoing pilot program, CBP officers and agents are trained to recognize the signs and symptoms of an opioid overdose and administer naloxone, a potentially life-saving drug for the treatment of opioid overdoses. CBP will continue to do all we can to refine and enhance the effectiveness of our detection and interdiction of fentanyl and other dangerous synthetic opioids being smuggled into the United States. Acting Chair Breyer and distinguished commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, questions?
You may not know the answer to this, but do you know along the drug distribution chain the knowledge that fentanyl is in the product? So, clearly the chemists making it know that it's in there. As you go further down the chain, how many of the people know that the product that they're selling has fentanyl in it? Or do you have sellers that they don't even know what it is that they're selling?
Most often, ma'am, they do not know.
They don't know.
They do not know. Sometimes they may. Depends on, it's customer based. You have a trafficker, they may say, okay, what's your coffee of the day? Which would be maybe heroin with some fentanyl in it, right? So most often, they may not know, but they may know. That's
Hard to
the way the
say.
business is.
If I can just add, there are indications oftentimes that they do know, because some of the mills that are being raided, you're finding personal protective equipment in there, which is something that you did not see when it was just purely heroin. But with now more fentanyl in the drugs, you're finding more equipment in these mills.
So the sign of the equipment means that they're aware of the risk associated. They would only know that if it is fentanyl.
Yes.
Okay.
One question, Major Clone. We may get into this a little bit later with some other panels, but are the laboratories in New Jersey able to keep up with the testing?
From a personnel, yes. The backlog started to increase as new analogs were being introduced, and they just couldn't keep up. So it was a justification to increase the workforce by 40 additional personnel. And now getting the new standards to make positive identification, their capabilities have been increased. But we were maybe at a 2-week backlog, then we went up to almost 4 months, but now we're coming back up to it because they recognize the challenges that fentanyl was posing.
Would that be for fentanyl as well as the analogs such as carfentanil? know, the,
It's because of
Levels.
fentanyl and all of the analogs, yes.
Judge Breyer, do you have any questions?
Yes, I'm trying to understand the distribution of the drug. For example, what was interesting in the testimony was that people could simply mail order, go online, I guess, and get this from some source outside the United States. Is that common? Is that the way it's generally distributed? Or is there some other method? In other words, are there suppliers in the United States that are manufacturing or supplying the fentanyl, or is it coming from abroad? And if so, how do people order it, and what is law enforcement doing to try to stop it?
You want to deal with that, Mr.?
Yes, absolutely, Commissioner. So the vast majority of what CBP encounters is coming from China and or Mexico along the southwest border. What we have found is that in smaller quantities along and or within the supply chains of express consignment parcels and or the U.S. Postal Service is by and large the quantity of seizures that we are interdicting. Now, as far as the quantity of the drug, when it does come through in mail parcels or express consignment packages, it's usually very small, although exceedingly pure, at times over 90% pure. The larger quantities, although less numbers of seizures, are occurring along the southwest border, where also emanating from China and heading into clandestine labs in Mexico, and oftentimes being cut with heroin or other substances, then being trafficked across the southern border, typically on persons or in cars. In that way. That's the vast majority, again, of what we've been seeing trending as far as CBP's interdictions are concerned.
Can the dogs detect both fentanyl and its analogs?
That's what we've trained them to do, Commissioner. So we're, again, quite optimistic about what we were able to pilot earlier this year with the training of the odor detection by the canines. As I mentioned in my opening statement, a little over 100 have already been trained. We've, as you might imagine, strategically deployed these to where we're seizing the most of these drugs, and we expect that by the end of this fiscal year, all of our narcotic detection canine teams at the ports of entry will be trained on fentanyl and the odors emanating from the analogs as well.
Analogs share in common the same.
Well, again, not being the canine expert within the agency, but knowing enough to be able to share with you that, yes, there's enough commonality within the odor for it to, at least at this time, detect all the analogs that we've encountered to date.
Any other questions, Judge Breyer?
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony this morning, and we have your more extensive written testimony in the record as well. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.